Thank you all for joining us. We're so grateful to have so many people here, and I think it's a testament to the level of interest in the topic today. We really want to start out by expressing our appreciation to our co-sponsors, the United Kingdom, Germany, the Netherlands, and Canada, for joining us today and convening this event. And I would like to welcome our distinguished panelists and guests to this timely event on the human rights crisis in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China. The United States, Canada, Germany, and the Netherlands are co-hosting today's event to continue raising international awareness of the dire situation in Xinjiang. China's mass internment of members of Muslim minority groups, Uighurs, ethnic Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and others, is raising alarm within the international community. China is arbitrarily detaining more than 1 million individuals under horrific conditions in Xinjiang's internment camps. Detainees face torture, forced labor, and death, according to credible reports. Chinese authorities have tried to convince the world that these are vocational training facilities and people are there voluntarily. Today's discussion will feature first-hand accounts and documentary evidence, including satellite imagery, revealing the truth that people are detained in these facilities against their will and because of their ethnic and religious background. The Chinese government's repression of members of Muslim minority groups due to their religion and/or ethnicity is not new. In addition to Muslims, Tibetans, Christians, those who practice Falun Gong, and members of other ethnic and religious minority groups have long suffered under Chinese government oppression. But what is new is the breadth of the repression and how the Chinese government is using breakthroughs in technology to increase its effectiveness. With the new campaign in Xinjiang that started in 2016-2017, Chinese government officials are using new technologies to target and control Muslim minorities, including through high-tech arbitrary surveillance and involuntary collection of personal data, including DNA samples. Chinese officials are also using low-tech approaches that have their roots in the Cultural Revolution. They have moved Chinese officials into Uyghur homes to monitor families and prevent the observance of Islamic practices. Chinese officials coerce members of Muslim minority groups to return to China from abroad, targeting their families for collective punishment if they refuse. Political education outside the camps has expanded, as has the targeting of religious, cultural, and business leaders. In carrying out these policies, Chinese government officials abuse fundamental freedoms enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on a daily basis. Arbitrary detention in the camps can last from months to years without trial or charge or contact with families. Those who have been in the camps tell us that detained individuals are required to renounce their ethnic identities, religious beliefs, cultural and religious practices. Outside the camps, Xinjiang has been described as an open-air prison for its Uyghur and other Muslim inhabitants. They are subject to constant random stops and searches, constrained in observing peaceful religious practices and speaking in their mother tongue, and monitored everywhere by a pervasive police presence that has grown exponentially in the past 2 years. These practices clearly contravene human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the right of freedom of religion of belief. The Chinese government has gone to great lengths to propagate outright falsehoods regarding the situation in Xinjiang. It contradicts its own government documents, which acknowledge that the goal is to sinicize and otherwise exert greater party control over Islam and other religions, and attempts to justify its actions under the guise of preventing terrorism and violent extremism. In reality, China's conflation of religious and ethnic identity with terrorism and so-called extremism is likely to fuel the very resentment, recruitment, and radicalization to violence that it claims it is seeking to avoid. Today, the United States calls on China to grant the March 2019 request from the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief to visit Xinjiang, and to grant similar requests by other mandate holders. Furthermore, we call on China to reverse its counterproductive policies that conflate terrorism with peaceful religious and ethnic expression or identity, to release all those arbitrarily detained, and to cease efforts to coerce members of Muslim minority groups residing abroad to return to China to face an uncertain fate. The United States will continue to promote accountability for those who are involved in human rights violations and abuses, including by considering targeted measures against Xinjiang officials. The United States urges all states to refrain from forcibly repatriating asylum seekers from Xinjiang back to China in accordance with their obligations under international law and consistent with the principle of non-refoulement. Today, we will hear from experts and view images of the situation in Xinjiang. I will now introduce our distinguished panelists for their remarks before opening the floor. Omir Bekali, a survivor who will provide first-hand accounts of life in Xinjiang's gulags. Professor Adrian Zenz, whose groundbreaking research has helped us to understand the scope and scale of this ongoing human rights crisis. UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion or Belief, Ahmed Shaheed, who seeks to promote protection for the rights of all individuals to practice their religion or belief. John Fisher of Human Rights Watch, who has worked to draw attention to this concerning issue. We will also hear from officials representing our co-sponsoring governments. So with that, I will turn things over to our first speaker, Omir Bekali.
Hello everybody. 2013 I was visited Urumqi and 5 of the police officers come to me and just arrest without letting me know anything. They just testing me, the medical testing, and they getting my blood and all other possible tests from my body, and they also take me to the under the police department secret offices and torture me very badly for 5 days. I can't remember exact, and they're asking me to sign for the one they prepared. I'm very sorry, I can't follow. If somebody tell him to speak a little bit slowly. And let he choose that channel 2, he can listen me if he need. And in this 16 quadrat rooms, we about 40 people is I has been 6 months, and for eating one meal every day, we have to appreciate for Communist Party and sing song about that Xi Jinping and thanks for the government. We can't move, we have no rights to talk, and even we can't wash hand. Even so, after 6 months, they transfer me to the so-called education camps. The Chinese authorities, under name of the against the Uighurs, who is in that education camp, we have to, first of all, we all have to accept eating the pork, first of all. If we are not accepting that, we have the 5 punishment. One is, if we are not eating, of course, then you have no rights to eat anything else. Second is they will be tortured badly. And the third one is we have to sit down. Let us sit is the so-called tiger chair. The 4 is that we are going to be pushed into the small cages which no connection for anything, and difficult for breathing either. So the last one is I didn't met the last one yet, but the last one is for that so-called the water prison, and it's very badly. I have no experience for the 5th one, and it's unhuman. If this is the place for, as the Chinese say, this is an education camp, and if it's really so, and why they are arresting my father, who's the 80 years old, a man who don't need this education actually, and I speak fluently in Chinese, and they say that they are teaching Chinese in the camp, but it's not really true. But every day there's people disappearing. Anywhere in our country, like Turfan or Karmay or Urumqi, anywhere, so they just disappear. We don't know we are them. When I am presenting it, so I have difficulty to express myself. You know, I am feeling I am in that so-called the education camp, what I call that's a concentration camp. I was 115 kilogram, but after I come out from this camp and I was become a 68 kilogram. So just less than a year time, that was what happened for my physical body. Until today, the Chinese government say that there is not such calling the concentration camp. So after I come first from the concentration camp and I calling this media and I am just telling everyone this, what's going on inside, like Czech, Japan, and some other places. So after then, I always got the threatening call. And even the people that come to meet me, threatening me to don't go on what I am doing right now for this rights for my nations in our country. My wishes is I would like to continue what I am doing. I don't want to give up. I need that my rights. I want to my people's rights in our hands. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Omir. Now I will turn to Dr. Zenz.
Ambassador Currie, ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? Is my microphone working? Firstly, I'd like to thank the United States and co-sponsoring governments of Germany, the Netherlands, United Kingdom, and Canada for holding this important event. I don't think we can take that for granted. Since late 2018, the Chinese state has embarked on a propaganda campaign that seeks to portray its detention and re-education drive in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region as a benign vocational training initiative. However, while vocational training has indeed often been one component of Xinjiang's de-extremification practice, it has never been either its primary means or its chief end. Rather, the state is using the vocational training component as a mask for an unprecedented campaign of coercive social re-engineering. Notably, hundreds of Uyghur intellectuals have disappeared, a population segment that's certainly not in need of vocational training, which espouses moderate views, has been comparatively irreligious, and would have been ideally placed to act as a cushion against extremist influence. But the primary aim of the re-education campaign in Xinjiang is neither employment creation nor, in fact, de-extremification, nor even the maintenance of social stability, although these are important goals. But these are all only means to an unstated ultimate goal, which I will mention later. An analysis of official documents and reports reveals that de-extremification is intimately linked with the concept of transformation through education, in Chinese 教育转化. In these documents, vocational skills training is never described as a remedy for extremism on its own account, but only as a component of re-education. 教育转化 denotes an intensive process of highly coercive indoctrination and thought reform. It has its roots in the infamous re-education through labor system. Since the publication of my report on Xinjiang's re-education in May 2018, essentially no new official procurement or construction bids with the keywords transformation through education, 教育转化, have been issued, and the state has adjusted its narratives. When official state representatives such as Hu Lianhe, an official of the United Front's Work Department, or Shohat Zakir, Xinjiang's governor, address global audiences, they carefully avoid the term 教育转化. Instead, they and others focus on speaking about de-extremification through vocational skills training. The strategy behind this is most evident to emphasize the presumably most benign aspect of the de-extremification drive while minimizing the less palatable re-education aspect. Research has established a damning link between re-education, 教育转化, and the intense and brutal brainwashing methods used against members of the Falun Gong. As revealed by a recent research report, Xinjiang's re-education drive is in fact coordinated by government officials who played a key role in the early re-education campaign against the Falun Gong and have had nearly 20 years of experience in such transformation through education efforts. Xinjiang's de-extremification ordinance from May 2017 does not even mention the term vocational skills training. In fact, all relevant government documents and reports published between 2013 and mid-2018, the connection between de-extremification and vocational or skills training is limited or non-existent. Apologize for the lack of translation, but just establishing facts. It was not until October 2018 that an amendment to Xinjiang's de-extremification ordinance introduced the concept of vocational skills education training centers, quote unquote. But again, vocational training is only mentioned in connection with the overarching concept of 教育转化. In fact, vocational skills education training centers are directly referred to as re-education institutions, 教育转化机构, on 3 occasions, as shown on the slide. It is important to distinguish Xinjiang's so-called vocational skills training from regular vocational education institutions. Xinjiang's various re-education facilities, including those labeled vocational skills education training centers, are heavily secured facilities that are in every respect designed to function as prison-like internment camps, with numerous security cameras and microphones in the classrooms, even visible on official CCTV footage, as shown here, although apparently they were removed before the visit of foreign delegations. The New York Times cited a former Xinjiang police officer as saying that he helped to bring 600 people to what he was told was a vocational training center. All of the 600 were handcuffed. What he saw at the center was not so much an educational facility, but a highly secured camp that looked like a prison. In 2017, Xinjiang's spending on regular vocational education was actually below the national Chinese average on a per capita basis. Between 2016 and 17, the spending actually decreased by 7.1%, while spending on the justice system, which administers the re-education vocational skills training, rose by 118%. In a minority region sample, even by 235%. Expenditures for detention center management in minority regions quadrupled, and the slides show one example from Khotan with massive expansions in 2017 and throughout 2018. At a side event here last week, a Chinese diplomat was quoted by Reuters as saying, "There's no internment camp, no concentration camp, there's only vocational training centers." This statement, however, is in direct contradiction to official government documentation, which identifies at least 8 different terms for various types of detention and training facilities in Xinjiang. Most of these have the expression transformation through education in the names. For each of these types, there are examples of government construction and procurement bids that call for strong internment camp-style security features, such as high walls, fences, cameras, watchtowers, or on-site police facilities. Notably, the word centralized, 集中, which is found in 2 of the 8 terms on the list, can also be translated as concentrated. The Chinese word for concentration camp, 集中营, employs this term. The claim that Xinjiang does not run any facilities that can technically be referred to as concentration camps is both semantically and factually problematic. The tours that China has given to diplomats and journalists of select countries were in each instance restricted to the same select camps in Khotan and Kashgar, where certain security features, such as barbed wire or cameras, were removed. In December 2018, Radio Free Asia cited a local police officer as saying that the authorities had been removing barbed wire and cameras from camps in preparation for visiting foreign delegations. Hundreds of Uyghur intellectuals have been detained since 2017. This massive crackdown on the intellectual elite points us to the real purpose of Xinjiang's re-education campaign. Uyghur intellectuals were in fact ideally placed to promote constructive engagement between the communities and the Chinese. However, the Chinese strategy is presently not at all predicated on harnessing moderate voices, because the main purpose of the re-education drive is not in fact the fight against extremism, although that is a very important aspect. And China does face a legitimate threat from separatism or violent resistance. One could, in some instances, also refer to it as terrorism. China's re-education campaign in Xinjiang is, however, above all, if we look at the historical process, a battle for ideological and ethno-racial control. From an academic standpoint, what we're witnessing in Xinjiang is nothing less than a systematic campaign of cultural genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zenz. And now, turn it over to the Special Rapporteur. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. First of all, thank you to the co-sponsors for inviting me to be in this panel, and also my co-panelists for being here to talk to all of us about our concerns, what's happening in Xinjiang province, and also for all of you for being with us as we think through this and look at ways how we could address them. We have heard witness testimony. We've heard an expert analysis of what's happening. I would plead that we take this very seriously. A commitment to human rights requires us to do no less. I've heard escalating concerns. My own concerns have been escalating based on reports I've been receiving over time from a variety of quarters, from Uyghur nationals giving testimonies about what's happened to them, from international human rights NGOs with a credible track record of giving us verifiable, credible information, from treaty body experts who are meticulous in how they assess information, from the High Commissioner herself, who's spoken about this subject. The OIC's 11th report on the Islamophobia has 3 or 4 pages expressing concern about what's happening in the province, and of course, special procedures themselves. So there's a wide body of reports, allegations, concerns expressed, which have been taken very seriously. I have, of course, written to the government on several subjects linked to the issues we've been talking about, including last November when I wrote about the de-extremification law, highlighting the extent to which the law, in my view, and view of my colleagues who joined me in the letter, violate China's obligation on international human rights law, and asking for more information and also highlighting what needs to be done to address those concerns. I've also had occasion to write to other governments where there have been reports of Chinese nationals being deported back to China when they might be facing persecution. So it's important for me to be here to join all of you to give a voice to the voiceless. This is something I think a mandate holder ought to be doing, especially when the scale of the issue we are talking about is quite significant. So as you would have observed, several of my mandate holder colleagues have joined me in many communications. I don't speak for them today, but I just want to highlight that my mandate engages a lot of other rights as well. You cannot actually respect FOB unless you had respect for a range of other human rights as well. So I'm sure that many of my colleagues will be equally concerned about the things I am saying today as well. I just want to frame what I've heard just now in the context of the work I have done for the Council and the GA in my last 5 reports. Almost all the reports I've done address some of the issues we've heard about today. For example, last March I reported to you here about the links between state and religion and how that can amplify or give space to amplify violations or give space to respecting FOB. And one of the concerns I had was different understandings of secularism, of state-imposed secularism, where the understanding is the state is hostile to religion. An attempt is made to really suppress all expression of religion in public square, including having an idea of what ought to be the right religion and then enforcing it upon people as the way to pursue. I offered many ways of addressing this issue in terms of the importance of having respectful distance between state and religion. My report to the GA last fall was on countering violent extremism, quite a relevant topic, I think, for today's subject, because there are reports of violent extremism and terrorism, but there are ways in which this ought to be handled. And proportionality is fundamental in the way in which states ought to address this, including respecting human rights in its full spectrum. Where threat of violence or certain discourses are there, there is no excuse for a state to suppress entire communities in terms of their faith-based identity or their peaceful expression of religion. So there is the need really to respect both the forum internum and the manifestation of religion peacefully by all communities. State cannot decide what is proper and improper religion or faith, or in the case of non-religious beliefs, what is appropriate for these communities. I've also stressed upon the interdependence of FOB and other rights, that state ought to respect freedom of movement, freedom of expression, and so on, in order to really properly respect the obligations under international human rights law to respect FOB. I also highlighted the actual importance of respecting FOB to create resilience against extremism, that the way to address concerns about terrorism or violence or hateful discourse is to actually respect human rights more than curtailing them, because going the other way would only result in escalating or creating more violence across communities. In my last report, I looked specifically about link between freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief. And I had a section there on concerns about emerging technologies and how that is used by various governments to suppress rights. And again, we hear very serious concerns about the forum internum itself being undermined by use of various surveillance techniques, various ways of monitoring people without them even recognizing that they're being monitored, watching their digital footprints and so on, as well as more standard surveillance techniques used because of enhanced technology. Again, we have concerns about this in the present case. So I want to reiterate the importance of China respecting its full obligation on international human rights law with regard to FOB, which requires it to respect all human rights under the human rights framework. I have requested the government to invite me to come to the country. I would implore on the government to take that request seriously because such wide concerns require a serious response from the government to demonstrate good faith on its part and to ensure that independent monitors can come and witness what is going on. A whole range of my colleagues are engaged on this subject. We have the rapporteur on respecting human rights while countering terrorism. We have the rapporteur on expression, rapporteur on minorities, myself, and many others. So I think the whole community of rapporteurs that the government can choose from to engage with on this subject to ensure that it discharges its obligations to people fully and also demonstrates good faith, that we can have confidence that the people in the region and elsewhere in China are having their rights fully respected. In the absence of such cooperation, in the absence of such transparency, we can only assume the worst about the reports we're receiving. Thank you.
And now our final speaker, John Fisher from Human Rights Watch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and our thanks to the lead sponsors and the co-sponsors for presenting this important event. We feel that it is significant to have a collective state attention to the crisis in Xinjiang region, and I know that for a number of states present in the room, it was a difficult decision as to whether to co-sponsor and that others would consider this. We hope that in future we will see the number of states willing to join together in expressing collective concern increase, and we would hope that this would also be transmitted into the Human Rights Council chamber itself. I'm also pleased to see so many of you here today. It's good that we have standing room only, which indicates, I think, the extent to which the issues we're addressing are of concern to many of you and are broadly shared. I understand that the delegation under consideration, China, was actively discouraging some from attending today's event, so I'm pleased to see so many of you failed to heed their warnings. Obviously, we are all joined today by a collective concern at the extent of the abuses in China's Xinjiang region, and these have now been well documented. Human Rights Watch produced ourselves a report called Eradicating Ideological Viruses, China's Campaign of Repression Against Xinjiang's Muslims. And in that report, we also documented the broad range of detentions, family members who are wanting to have access to their loved ones who haven't been able to hear from them, those who have been able to leave the detention centres when they felt that they had been, or when the authorities felt that they had been sufficiently treated to be model citizens. We heard of instances of torture and ill treatment within the centres. We heard of the indoctrination exercises that those who were detained were forced to undergo. This takes place also in the context of sweeping surveillance across the region and of policies and practices which also seek to deter in the name of what's called de-extremification, practices of freedom of religion, as well as freedom of expression, culture, identity, and much more. We've heard differing narratives as to the purpose for these camps, but I think it's probably best summarized in the words of the Chinese authorities themselves. So, for example, a Communist Party secretary in Xinjiang said, "The training and education is to eliminate the hidden dangers affecting stability in our society and to put people whom we do not trust in a trusted place. It is to make them into people who are politically qualified. It's to let them learn legal knowledge to learn Han Chinese. They are clothed, given food and a place to live. Under militarized management, they develop good habits and regular schedules so that later they can be role models for their children, family, and friends." Or in the words of another Communist Youth League official in Xinjiang, "The training has only one purpose, to learn laws and regulations, to eradicate from the mind thoughts about religious extremism and violent terrorism, and to cure ideological diseases. If the education is not going well, we will continue to provide free education until the students achieve satisfactory results and graduate smoothly." Of course, the camps are seen somewhat differently by those who experience them. And so, as one Uyghur representative told us, what they want is to force us to assimilate, to identify with the country such that in the future the idea of Uyghur will be a name only, but without its meaning. Others told us, they say this is a political education camp, but in reality it is like a prison. It is surrounded by metal bars everywhere. One of the relatives of a detainee said that their brother was being held in a political education camp because he'd gone to a foreign country and that his brain needs to be cleaned. So as we can see, it's even with the narratives advanced by Chinese authorities themselves, there is an acknowledgement that one of the main purposes of these camps is indoctrination. And that's borne out in also some of the exercises that we were told about in our research that detainees had to undergo. For example, one said that they had to learn to sing propaganda songs praising President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party. We had to sing songs like, "Without the CCP, there's no new China," and "Socialism is good." Then before meals, we had to stand and say, we feel grateful for the party, grateful for the motherland, and grateful for President Xi. We wish President Xi good health, that the motherland is prosperous, and the ethnic groups are in harmony. That was accompanied by restrictions on what those who were detained couldn't say and do. So, for example, we weren't allowed to say "Assalamu alaikum," a religious greeting, but "Ni hao ma," and speak Mandarin only. And if I used Turkic language words, they would punish me. We also heard about torture and ill treatment within detention centres. One of the people that we spoke to said, "A detainee showed me his scar from being hung from the ceiling. He didn't have any religious materials, but after being hung for a night, he said he would agree to anything." Another one said, "I got very tired and fatigued from sitting in that iron chair. In the iron chair, they didn't really wake you up, but you couldn't sleep either because everything hurts. Your knees, neck, and back hurts. The guards told us that Uyghurs and Kazakhs are the enemies of China and that they want to kill us and make us suffer, and that there's nothing that we can do about it." So there's a lot more, of course, in our reports that we documented based upon interviews and other materials. And I think what we are seeing is that, fortunately, there is an increasing attention to the situation, including through UN channels. A significant turning point was reached when the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination issued its report, calling what's happening in Xinjiang, or calling Xinjiang region itself, a rights-free zone. We've heard special procedures speak out. We've heard the High Commissioner express concern at the conditions and the policies and practices in Xinjiang region, and call for independent access so that there can be scrutiny and an independent assessment of what is taking place within the region. In terms of China's own narratives, I think it's telling that they have shifted quite substantially since the news of the ill treatment and arbitrary detention began to break. Initially, there were denials that these camps even existed. And then when it was pointed out that you could see them from space, it was acknowledged that, yes, they do exist, but in fact they have purposes, for example, vocational training, or that it's intended to help to eliminate extremism and combat terrorism. However, it's hard to believe that any measure to combat terrorism could target an entire population in the way that it does and place such sweeping restrictions. It's not clear that any of the individuals detained in these places have committed any crime. And if they has there been any due process? Have they had access to lawyers? Have they had the ability to challenge any determination? And of course, the answer to all of those questions is no. At a side event by civil society that we hosted together with other civil society organizations last week, a delegation from China said that the purpose of the detention was preventative. And of course, preventative means that the individuals haven't done anything wrong yet, and yet they are still in detention. If these are vocational training centers, are the individuals free to leave when they want? And our understanding is that no, of course they're not. So it's clear that detention is taking place. It's not denied by the Chinese authorities. And it's clear that there is no access to due process, which makes it arbitrary detention, as we all know. Clearly, sweeping violations on this kind of scale call out for action by the international community, including by the Human Rights Council. But one of the questions for us is, what then are the impediments to the Council taking action to address these concerns? It's clear that, obviously we welcome a side event like this, and we think it is, significant that there are so many of you here. But a side event ultimately is no substitute for formal action by the Human Rights Council, the main body tasked with addressing human rights violations on this kind of scale. And so we do look to states to step up, to make their voices heard. A number of civil society organizations have joined together to call for the Human Rights Council to adopt a resolution, to put in place a fact-finding mission or other mechanism to bring independent scrutiny to the situation in Xinjiang and report back to the Human Rights Council. Of course, we recognize that a resolution itself is, under political circumstances, quite a stretch. And one of the challenges is that, the main state that has been willing to stand up to China in the past no longer engages with the Human Rights Council, and those other states who remain on the Human Rights Council have not shown a strong willingness to stand up to China. So as a result, there is a gap of leadership, and we look to states here to join together to make your voices heard and to ensure that that voice is heard and there is action at the Human Rights Council. Last year, I think many saw one of the high points of the Council as the collaboration between the EU and the OIC to present a strong resolution for accountability for Rohingya Muslims being mistreated, of course, in Myanmar. And this would be a prime case calling out for similar collaboration in order to address the situation. So we're therefore very disappointed when at the recent meeting of the Council of Foreign Ministers of the OIC, far from adopting a resolution expressing concern at what was happening to Uighurs and others in Xinjiang. In fact, the OIC adopted a resolution commending China for its treatment of Muslims. I think the actual language of the resolution is, welcomes the visit conducted by the delegation upon invitation from the People's Republic of China, commends the efforts of the People's Republic in China in providing care to its Muslim citizens, and looks forward to further cooperation between the OIC and the People's Republic of China. And I have to say that when I read that resolution just a few days ago, to be honest, my blood ran cold at the idea of, what does it take for a state to be so intolerant of the least criticism that it places that kind of pressure upon states to praise their oppressor. And also, what is the, we're used to, I think, states not going as far as we would like in speaking out on situations of concern, but to not just fail to speak out, but actually commend China for mistreatment and abuse and violations on such a massive scale, I think gives all of us cause for concern as to what the future may hold if we don't take the opportunity here and now at the session of the Council to ensure that within the Council chamber the situation is addressed with the seriousness it warrants. There is still time, and The Council obviously will run until the end of next week. Item 2, general debate, is one of the last debates to be heard, and we would look to all of the states who have expressed themselves so far to join together, to express yourselves collectively, and ultimately to move towards the kind of resolution process that is needed to ensure that China is held to the same standards as everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And so now I would like to give our co-sponsors an opportunity to make brief remarks as well before we open the session up to broader participation. So if I can ask our German colleagues to please kick us off with co-sponsor remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank the panelists for the detailed background information, my opinion, very moving and very personal testimony, as we have heard, as well as valuable first-hand knowledge on the situation in Xinjiang and on some of the serious and wide-ranging allegations of human rights violations. Given the lack of access to Xinjiang for independent observers and the shifting narrative of the Chinese side, this we found is extremely helpful. Germany and China have a broad partnership on a wide range of multi- and bilateral issues based on the common understanding that the international community can only tackle the most urgent global issues by dialogue and cooperating with each other. However, that does not mean that we agree on all issues. Germany remains very concerned about the deteriorating human rights situation in China, in particular in Xinjiang, where, according to credible reports, as we have heard right now, Uighurs suffer from systematic and widespread discrimination. We have raised this issue repeatedly, bilaterally, with the Chinese side. For example, in the session of the UPR last November, we recommended to China to commit to receiving UN special procedures and allow them unhindered access, including to areas home to Muslim ethnicities like the Uighurs. We have recommended to investigate allegations of mass detention and severe restrictions of the right of freedom of religion and belief, opinion and expression, peaceful assembly, association, and cultural life. Given the possible scale and the seriousness of the human rights violations in Xinjiang, we would like to join the call on China to allow independent observers meaningful and unhindered access to Xinjiang, including the High Commissioner for Human Rights and UN Special Rapporteurs. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I will turn to the United Kingdom for the second remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Currie. The United Kingdom is pleased to co-sponsor this important event, and I'd like to thank the distinguished panel of speakers for their presentations today. We're particularly grateful to Special Rapporteur Dr. Shaheed for his presence. We believe that everyone should be free to practice their religion according to their beliefs, and we work towards worldwide acceptance of the idea that the presence of other faiths does not threaten the identity of a religion or a state or a culture. The prohibition of some religious groups and the legal restrictions and harassment aimed at others undermines freedom of religious belief. The United Kingdom has serious concerns about the human rights situation in Xinjiang. As we have heard previously and again today, there are consistent and credible reports that over 1 million Uighurs have been held in camps against their will. There are also credible reports of widespread surveillance and restrictions targeted at religious and ethnic minorities, particularly Uyghur Muslims. We recognize that all states must have measures to address legitimate security concerns, and we ourselves have at times struggled with the best way to address the threat of terrorism in our own country. But what is clear, and what we have learned, is that responses must be in accordance with human rights obligations, and that acting otherwise ends up being counterproductive. Events like this one today give us and other countries an opportunity to learn more about the reality of the situation in Xinjiang, as well as hearing different analysis and ideas. Whilst UK officials have visited the region, it has proved extremely difficult to be able to verify key facts, such as numbers detained, periods of detention, and whether there is any criminal justification for any of the detentions. What is clearly needed is unfettered access for international human rights mechanisms so that they can make their own assessments and provide objective public reporting. We know that there have been certain visits arranged by China for particular journalists and state delegations. China has made repeated reference to such visits in its recent public statements. However, these visits have been selective and do not provide the reassurance that we would all get by having recognized independent international human rights mechanisms carry out such visits. We hope that China will engage both with the mechanisms of the Human Rights Council and the treaty bodies, which have provided important recommendations relating to Xinjiang. We hope that China will rethink its position on UPR recommendations and will implement the recommendations of the CERD on Xinjiang. We look forward to hearing the views of others and thank the panelists once again for their presence. Thank you.
I now call on our Dutch colleagues.
Thank you, Ambassador Currie. Dear panelists, dear guest, thank you for joining us today at this side event. The Kingdom of the Netherlands considers Event on Human Rights to be about respect for human rights and their universality, respond to issues raised, and reach out to the oppressed. Side events are fundamental to meaningful discussions about human rights. They serve to inform us all, states, UN representatives, and civil society, about human rights situations of concern. Ladies and gentlemen, the Kingdom of the Netherlands has serious concerns about the human rights situations in Xinjiang. International reports and today's panel present us with credible information that religious minorities like Uighurs are intimidated and detained in re-education camps. Dr. Zen's work has been of great significance in this regard. We are thankful for his tireless efforts to raise awareness about the scope of the events in Xinjiang. We are also grateful for brave individuals like you, Mr. Bekali, who dare to speak about their experience. Such personal accounts are invaluable for our understanding of the situation, particularly as independent observers are denied meaningful, unsupervised access to the region. The Kingdom of the Netherlands is a staunch supporter of UN mechanisms and institutions. We are convinced that providing access to UN mechanisms is a precondition for meaningful discussion. As we stated under item 2 this week and during the UPR in November, as well as through EU statements, we urge China to cooperate fully with relevant UN bodies. Distinguished panelists, thank you again for your contributions today. Your work is crucial for the protection and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms of the people in Xinjiang. Let us all respect, reach out, and respond.
Ambassador Moroni from Canada, thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Canada is pleased to participate in this event on fundamental freedoms in Xinjiang. The opportunity to formally engage with states as well as with civil society is an important hallmark of Human Rights Council's side events. All countries have human rights concerns, and Canada is no different in this regard. But the Council is obligated to shine a spotlight on all areas where any state is not meeting its human rights obligations. It is a critical function of the Human Rights Council, and our credibility in part rests on all of our willingness to engage and to support and protect human rights around the globe, including in Xinjiang. Canada thanks very much the panelists, Dr. Shaheed, Dr. Zenz, Mr. Fisher, and Mr. Bekali, for providing their perspectives and research today. Information from many and diverse sources is critical to getting a complete picture of any human rights situation, and we're especially grateful to Mr. Bekali for sharing his experiences with us, because personal accounts give a human face to human rights challenges and reminds us that violations and abuses of human rights are not just statistics. They represent a human cost and real suffering. As the Special Rapporteur reminded us, people must not be arbitrarily detained anywhere on the basis of religion or ethnicity. And so we call on China to allow unfettered access to the United Nations and OHCHR in a spirit of transparency so the UN can fulfill its mandate to investigate human rights violations wherever they occur. I have one question for Mr. Fisher on the panel. In the absence of action on the part of the Human Rights Council, which treaty body do you think is the next best forum to put a spotlight on the situation of minority Muslim groups in Xinjiang? Thank you to all the participants.
I'm happy to begin with our European Union colleague and welcome them to take the floor at this time.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would like to commend the organizers for convening this event and the panelists for shining light on a worrying situation in Xinjiang. I would like to recall that the European Union has publicly expressed its concern, again recently in the Item 4 statement delivered this week, and I quote, "The EU is concerned about the existence of political re-education camps and widespread surveillance and restrictions particularly targeted at Uighurs in Xinjiang. We urge China to allow meaningful access to Xinjiang for independent observers, including for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights," end quote. Last month, the EU Council conclusions on EU priorities in UN human rights fora said, talked about following with concern the situation in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region with the existence of political re-education camps and the widespread surveillance and restrictions particularly targeted at Uyghurs. The High Representative and Vice President Federica Mogherini has clearly stated our position on several occasions, including on the 4th of October 2018 at the European Parliament, where Commissioner Bieńkowska, speaking on her behalf, stressed the EU's concerns, and also in a statement of the High Representative herself on the 26th of October of the same year. The EU has taken a number of steps to proactively engage with China and Xinjiang. We have systematically raised the issue at different levels, including at the latest Human Rights Dialogue, and accepted to participate in a visit to Xinjiang earlier this year. The recent decision by China to offer supervised visits to international journalists and foreign officials is a first step towards much-needed greater transparency. However, it is important and consistent with China's commitment to multilateralism and with China's membership in the Human Rights Council that China allows meaningful and unrestricted access to Xinjiang for independent observers, including for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the EU Special Envoy for Religious Freedom. Thank you.
Sure, and thank you for the question, which was, in the absence of council action, which treaty bodies would be applicable. Obviously, there are a number of treaty bodies which would have relevant issues within their mandates. The Human Rights Committee itself, the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, the Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture, and the Committee Against Torture. The issue is that China, of course, hasn't ratified all of the international instruments, which may limit the access to some of those bodies. There are a range of special procedures, obviously, who would also have relevant mandates. And I'm not yet willing to accept the premise, or I'm not actually at all willing to accept the premise that it's in the absence of Human Rights Council action, because, of course, these are not mutually incompatible. We do feel that, of course, the High Commissioner has already made an independent request for access and independent scrutiny, as have special procedures like Dr. Shaheed. But the Human Rights Council has a responsibility also to address the issue. I think we were encouraged that at the recent Item 4 debate, just within the last day or so, we saw statements by the EU as a whole, Germany, Finland, France, Switzerland, the UK, the Czech Republic, Australia, Canada. We've heard Turkey speak out quite strongly through their foreign minister at the high-level segment, and others. So we are encouraged that there are a growing number of voices at the Human Rights Council calling for action, and we do believe that there is an opportunity and a responsibility to ensure that that is also brought forward within the Council chamber.
Thank you. If I may add to that, there are many things that can be done in Geneva, certainly, and John has referred to them. But I think it's important to be able to visit the province to make an on-site inspection. Not many treaty bodies can do that. So I think in that context, a mechanism, the special procedures can do that. Not just my mandate, but other mandates are there as well. It would be ideal to have several able to travel together, at least a couple, given the complexity of the issue and the range of the issues we've highlighted. But certainly, it's one that will enable on-site inspection of what's happening in the region.
So next on my list, I have the People's Republic of China, to be followed by Venezuela and Switzerland. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor. On behalf of the Chinese mission, we strongly object this anti-China side event sponsored by the U.S. mission. We oppose that the mission of UK, Germany, and Netherlands and Canada co-sponsor this political-driven event. We regret that the organizer has invited so-called former detainee to attend this event, this meeting. Unfortunately, what he said is not true. According to our information, Omir Bekali, Kazakh citizen, was investigated by the Chinese Public Security Authority for suspected crimes in organizing, leading, and joining terrorist organizations in 2017. His lawful rights are protected according to the law during his investigation. After that, considering that the circumstance of his crime is minor, the Chinese authority decided not to prosecute him for the criminal liability and release him on bail pending trial, ordering him to exit China within a prescribed time limit. On December 4th, 2017, he left for Kazakhstan. He mentioned about his family. I would like to introduce the state quo. His mother and eldest and youngest sister are all at home and doing the farmer works. His second elder sister are now work in the community in Karame city. His younger brother is a vegetable vendor in Changji of Xinjiang. They all enjoy personal freedom. His father, a patient with advanced liver cancer, died on September 18, 2018, after all rescue measures proved ineffectual. It is a complete lie to claim that Omir Bekali and his family members are persecuted by the Chinese government. Having said that, I would like to highlight the following points. 1. There's no so-called concentration camp in Xinjiang. As we have explained and for many times since 1990s, thousands of terrorist attacks happened in Xinjiang. Countless innocent people lost their lives and families. This poses serious threats to the fundamental rights of Xinjiang people. As any responsible government, China has to take strong measures to counter terrorism, including by setting up the vocational education training center. Those centers are nothing else but normal boarding schools. They teach common language, law, and skills. All rights of the trainees are fully protected. They can go home, they can communicate with or receive their families. Those measures haven't taken effect. There's no terrorist attacks for 27 consecutive months. Xinjiang is much safer ever before. If those centers are called concentration camp, how about the metal cages at the US southern border? 2. China has already invited many diplomats, media representatives, and scholars from dozens of countries, including some PRs in Geneva, to visit Xinjiang. What they witnessed is totally different from those distorted reports, including today's. We welcome more objective and fair people to visit Xinjiang in future. 3. China always advocates cooperation and dialogue in human rights issues, oppose politicizing and double standards. Unfortunately, this side event is obviously driven by political agenda, tries to interfere in China's internal affairs, and destabilize Xinjiang. Terrorism and extremism is a common enemy of the humankind. If any country take double standards on human rights and counterterrorism, they will get backfired. I thank you.
And now we will have a representative of the Maduro regime speak.
The Maduro legitimacy presidency, thank you. Once again, another progressive country, an ally of the social struggles and the development of the country south to south, is the object of unfounded accusations by the United States of America and its acolytes. Unusual is that those who run over the human rights of the peoples of developing countries, promoting and sponsoring the destabilization of its economies and societies, make pronunciations against any nation, even less against China, where human rights and fundamental freedoms are fully enjoyed. It has been proved that the socialist system has provided a solid institutional guarantee to human rights development in Xinjiang. The rapid economic and social development has provided a solid material foundation, and the harmonious and stable political environment has ensured a satisfactory social environment. The achievements of the People's Republic of China in the field of human rights in all these regions are undeniable. The opportunities that the Chinese government places within the reach of its people for his well-being and improvement make this country a global example in terms of the realization of the right to development. China is as well a global leader in matters of international cooperation. We express our concern about the practice of naming and shaming some countries with the aim of intervening in the internal affairs of states, flagrantly violating the principles established in the UN Charter. We strongly reject the politicization of the UN spaces based on double standards and media manipulation that goes against the good practices based on cooperation and constructive dialogue. No solution may be achieved abandoning the Human Rights Council. The use of the United Nations for the proliferation of these kind of events must end. Thank you.
I wonder that you showed up. So next on my list, I have Switzerland, followed by New Zealand, and then, yeah, let's go with those two. And I do remind everybody, leave the room at 6 o'clock, and we did get a little bit of a late start. But thank you.
Thank you very much. We would like to thank the organizers and participants for this important side event. Switzerland rests very concerned about the reports of the re-education centers that you have outlined in your presentation. And if I may, I would like to ask two questions. The one is that whether you have seen indications that practices observed and documented in Xinjiang are also to be found in other provinces of the country. And the other one would be that there have been reports about the transportation of internees to other provinces. If you can elaborate more on that one. Thank you.
Thank you. And New Zealand, if you could go ahead, and then we'll take those questions.
Thank you. A short question, and it's for John Fisher or anyone else that wishes to comment. And that's a Chinese delegate mentioned bilateral dialogue and cooperation, which many of our countries have. What value do you see of that nature of dialogue, bilateral dialogue, versus multilateral efforts, which, as we've heard today, may cause more tensions, perhaps? Thanks.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions, I think mostly for John, but I would invite our other panelists, if they have information on these issues, to jump in.
Sure. Well, there are a range of views on the table, shall we say. I mean, I would assure our colleagues from the delegations of China and Venezuela that Human Rights Watch participates in this panel with no political agenda. We value our own independent voice. We share the concerns of the delegation of China about abusive practices at the U.S. southern border, and we were pleased to co-sponsor an event on that earlier today. But that is partly a reflection of the fact that we are even-handed, I think, in the states. with whom we engage and about whose practices we express concerns, and there is no denying the fact that the violations we are seeing in Xinjiang are on a scale that demands attention from the Human Rights Council. We've always believed that the response to allegations of selectivity is to bring attention to a broader range of situations, not less. And obviously, it would undermine the very purpose and intent of a body like the Human Rights Council if the rejection of any kind of multilateral engagement or a feeling that national sovereignty should trump international human rights were allowed to prevail. So it's difficult to see how one reconciles the assertion of national sovereignty with membership in a body like the Human Rights Council, where we would hope that that delegations like China would support the attention to the range of human rights concerns that we're addressing today. In relation to whether we see these kinds of practices outside of Xinjiang, it's clear, I think, that what is happening in Xinjiang is on an unprecedented scale. But of course, we also, as Human Rights Watch, see that as a reflection of a broader intolerance for dissenting voices within China, and we have for a long time documented, for example, crackdowns on human rights defenders, on journalists, on lawyers, and encouraged the Council and other international mechanisms to take appropriate action. So clearly, that's part of a larger set of human rights concerns in relation to China. And finally, in relation to the question about bilateral dialogue and cooperation versus multilateral engagement, again, we don't see these as mutually inconsistent. There's always scope for engagement and cooperation. That said, we've not seen, I think, a genuine acknowledgement that there is a human rights issue to be addressed, and we see this reflected in the photo displays, the staged visits, the other elements that the state concerned seems to acknowledge it has a case to answer, but is not yet heeding the message that the international community as a whole is concerned, and this is and should be a concern for the international community as a whole.
Thank you. If I may, I just want to add to this last point, the question for New Zealand about bilateral dialogues. They're not mutually exclusive. I think we could pursue both these channels. But the thing about bilateral dialogues is that if they come at the expense of other channels, then there's a problem. It's important that transparency is maintained. Often civil society is ruled out of what happens in these discussions. So if there is progress benchmarked, if there is transparency on what happens, then this can be useful, given political will on the part of the parties concerned to actually make progress. But if they become more of a game, then obviously, we lose the opportunity to highlight issues in a multilateral framework, where I think having that exposure can create more pressures on government concern to address the issues more seriously. So I think they're not exclusive, but I think they need to really make sure that we are benchmarking and being transparent. Beyond Xinjiang, yes, the mandate has written many communications with China on several issues. Like John said, there are broader concerns about, I think, intolerance and disregard for fundamental human rights. But also in some regions, there is also a degree of interference in the autonomy of those faiths, as is happening in Xinjiang. But the scale, I think, is unprecedented. And that's why this is so important to specifically focus on this particular region.
Firstly, regarding the transposition of detainees to other provinces, there have been reports by Bitter Winter and Radio Free Asia. I do not have anything to add to this. I would argue that this is a very concerning and interesting finding that, however, would need further substantiation at this point in time. Xinjiang does have active and ongoing cooperations with neighboring Muslim-oriented provinces such as Gansu and Ningxia in terms of de-extremification work and the management of religion. These certainly are first signs, along with the destruction of mosques or the removal of religious signs from mosques in these also predominantly Muslim regions, is very concerning. We can see developments and parallels. But above all, I would say that the fact that Beijing is so strongly behind this incredible thing that's going on in Xinjiang, and I think there was no space in my presentation to say that no academic, no long-standing expert with decades and years of experience researching Xinjiang and the Uighurs believes the vocational training narrative. And all of them have lost contact to friends, informants. All of them share this concern. It's by no means that I kind of stand out as an academic who is accusing China over Xinjiang. No, all academics, all Western academics share this concern very consistently. And the fact that Beijing is so strongly behind this massive thing that's going on in Xinjiang, which clearly cannot be hidden any longer, and threatens other governments who are making statements, such as Turkey, with the withdrawal of tourism recommendations or closing down consulates, and possible further economic consequence for economic cooperation, tells me that the re-education campaign in Xinjiang is part of a larger, more strategic effort that may well see expansion beyond Xinjiang and possibly even beyond China.
I have only 2 words to say. If the Chinese say I am the terrorist, if I am really a terrorist, why you are not shoot me down at that time? You said my dad is a liver cancer. You said he was cancer, but he was so healthy person. He's my dad, I know. If you say you did right, you have your video camera, all rooms you have recorded. Can you show that 8 months what you did for me and my dad in that concentration camp?
So now I have on my list, I do want to give some of our civil society members a chance to have an intervention. We have Amnesty International and the Society for Threatened Peoples on our list, and then I have the delegation of Belarus. So if we can take those 3, that would be fantastic. And I know we're running really close. I'm going to ask everybody to keep it pretty close so that we can then have a final chance to do a little round robin here and then wrap up on time. So Amnesty is on my left. Where are Amnesty friends? There you are back there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panelists. Just to add, I mean, we share the deep concerns about the serious human rights violations ongoing in Xinjiang, and the refusal to allow unrestricted access to independent human rights monitors. In September, Amnesty International published a report documenting our concerns and called on the Chinese authorities to provide credible answers to questions about the recent crackdown. As we have heard, in the face of mounting evidence, the Chinese government acknowledged the camp's existence in late 2018, but continued to claim that they're merely vocational training centers. We think that the narrative that there are no human rights violations in Xinjiang would be far more credible if the authorities were allowing full and unfettered access to the region to independent human rights monitors who are capable of providing an independent and impartial assessment, so notably the High Commissioner for Human Rights and special procedures. This, as far as I can see, is the only way to respond to the incredibly serious allegations that are on the table. I'm not sure if we will have time to hear again from the panelists, but I would be very interested to hear more about their views on what additional value UN investigation fact-finding mission could add. As Amnesty International, we've joined a call for a fact-finding mission. We think this is an essential action for the Council to take in line with its mandate to separate facts from fiction and to identify exactly what to put on record official human rights situation in the region. So I'd be very interested to hear from panelists about what the value added would be if there is another round. Thank you.
Society for Threatened Peoples, please.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, of course, thank you so much for having this event. It's very important for us. I think one just brief comment and 2 very brief questions. The first is that from the perspective of civil society, this is not a political question. It's a moral question for the Uyghurs that I speak to every day overseas. I speak to Uyghurs every single day. It is not a political issue. It's a moral issue. They want to know what's happening to their family members. We want to know what's happening on the ground in the region. The very basic, the easiest thing would be to do is to allow independent investigators to visit the region. So related to that, to the Special Rapporteur, I guess, so you've reached out for a possible visit. I'm wondering what steps can perhaps be taken now if there is no response, I guess from special procedures more broadly. And then also a question to either John or Adrian. It's a bit confusing. I mean, is there any kind of legal basis for these facilities? In your research and in Human Rights Watch's reporting, where have you seen sort of the legal basis for the camps or facilities, however you want to call them? Thanks.
And Belarus, again, I would remind you, we're very close on our closing time, so please, if you could just go directly to a question, that would be wonderful.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Strangely enough, my country's plate is not in the folder. I have been in Xinjiang a couple of weeks ago. I have visited the centers in Kashi and Hotan, and I have not seen anything of those horrible things which I have heard here ascribed to these centers. Instead, I have seen modern facilities for training and education, and I have seen absolutely normal young people. Even more than that, I have played ping pong with them for some 20 minutes unattended by anyone, and had a pretty good chance to speak with them. So generally, they told me that they were happy to be there because the government gave them the second chance. All of them have committed some misdemeanors. So my question to the panel is this. If these vocational training centers had not existed, and these young people would have ended up in prison, would you be happy for their fate? Thank you very much.
Let me respond to Belarus. I think China has a legal right to guard itself against violent acts that affect normal society and normal life. What we're witnessing in Xinjiang is a large-scale campaign that has a whole host of other reasons and aspects to it. And therefore, I think it'd be much better if those who are detained know why they're detained, on what grounds, and for how long, and that would be a formal conviction, and that their family members would be notified, that they could have legal assistance, and that'd be transparency and access for independent investigations. And I think then everybody would be quite accepting of any legitimate measures taken against people who are actually dangerous to society. The value of a fact-finding mission, I think there's not enough time to discuss this. I think a fact-finding mission could also be very risky because it might end up being a North Korea tour that simply confirms propaganda statements. The legal basis of administrative detention beyond 15 days is, according to legal experts, which I am not, very questionable and problematic. It's also questionable whether Xinjiang's ordinance, the extremification ordinance, is actually sufficient to legalize administrative detentions longer than 15 days that come without formal conviction or due process. And here the voices I've heard say, no, it's not. There would actually have to be a definite legal basis for such a strong exception from the central government. Thank you.
Okay. Adrian, can you turn off your microphone? And then, Mr. Bekali, if you have any closing
remarks. Thank you very much for all listening me. I believe the justice will be success. I know your injustice law will be end one day. If you have democracy, you can give me my simple communication rights for me to communicate with my relatives. So I have no idea what's going on for them, and I never possible to contact with them. If there is really justice and freedom, please give them passport, let them free travel, let them come to Kazakhstan, or I can meet with them. Then we believe what you're saying. I'm not going to talk that much. Only I say what I see at the inside. I saw inside the professors, doctorate, the businessmen, millionaires. Do you think all of them is a terrorist? My dad was working for a whole his life to Communist Party. Do you think my dad is a terrorist as well? Don't lie. I never give up what I am doing, like Germany, America, Canada, and some others, like Uighurs, Kazakhs, and those Christians, righteous. I never give up. I will continue for what I believe and what we stand for.
Thank you. Very quickly, I think all responses require state cooperation. So I think it's fundamental here is Chinese government's cooperation to attempts by the human rights monitors to verify the facts on the ground. Given the scale of the violations, I think it's beyond the scope of perhaps one mandate holder to look at them. I think so multiple person visit would be what's required here, but independent expert monitors of what happens, so people who won't get fooled by concerns we raised here earlier. What can I do if my request visit is denied? Well, I have no magic wand, but you can assure that special procedures will increasingly become public in our disquiet if there's no cooperation coming towards us in our concerns about what's happening in different countries. Thank you.
And John, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, there was a question about the legal basis for the camps, and as others have said, states are entitled to take lawful measures to combat terrorism. What they're not allowed to do is to identify an entire population as potential terrorists and discriminate on that basis. The applicable legal framework is, of course, the international legal framework, which includes provisions against arbitrary detention, against torture, which reaffirms freedoms of expression and religion and rights of privacy. And so all of those need to be respected, and it's clear that's not the case here. We certainly share the view that we're opposed to politicization, but so let's put politics aside. From a human rights standpoint, the case is clear. All of these rights are being violated. From a human rights standpoint, I think most people in this room would acknowledge that something needs to be done and the international mechanisms need to be fully engaged. And yet the only obstacle to more concerted HRC action are political obstacles, because states will privately acknowledge to us that the main reason there isn't a more coherent and focused response is because of bilateral political concerns. So we need to put the politics aside and we need to address the situation on its merits. And on its merits, it demands access, independent scrutiny, and reporting back to the Human Rights Council.
Thank you. I would like to thank all of our panelists for their very interesting, deep, and varied presentations today. I think that we've heard from a number of different perspectives about the situation, about the need for greater attention to efforts to protect fundamental rights and freedoms in Xinjiang, and the need for expanded UN attention and engagement on this is clear, I think, from what I've heard today, certainly. I, again, want to extend our gratitude and thanks to our co-sponsors. And as a visitor from Washington, my thanks to the U.S. mission here in Geneva and our great Shaheed, who and the team here who put this wonderful event together and did so much to support that. I also want to encourage people. Today, the United States issued its human rights reports. Actually, just a few moments ago in Washington, the Secretary rolled those out, and so those are now available for the 2018 human rights reports are now up and live online, so please feel free to access those and refer to those. We welcome that attention as well. And again, thank all of you, those who spoke out and who made interventions. All of the interventions helped, I think, to shape our understanding of this situation in some way, and so we deeply appreciate all of them. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a great evening.